Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be talking today about rather grandly named topic, global mobility and ultra flexible working. It's really going to be exploring all of the changes, all of the adjustments we've all had to make over the last year in various lockdowns and non-lockdowns and back into lockdown again. But really expecting the webinar today to last no more than an hour. And don't worry, for some of the questions we've already got in the chat box, we will send through a recording afterwards. So we are going to have loads of time for Q&A at the end. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Questions for the panel in the Q&A box, and if you want to say anything to the rest of the attendees, there's a chat box as well. Yeah, so please do. And then the last thing I wanted to say just before we get started is we will be sending around a feedback form after the webinar, as we always do. Please do take the time to fill it in. I know everyone's incredibly busy, but it's really helpful for us. It helps us to guide the topics that we run future webinars on, workshops, and all the rest of it, and then also helps us to improve as well. So with that to say, let's get started. So really happy, I've got two fantastic experts joining us today. So we're going to be starting the webinar with a presentation from David Udall, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A section and panel discussion. So David is a partner at Smith Williamson. Smith Williamson, for those who don't know, is one of the top 10 accountancy firms in the UK. And David is one of their international employment tax specialists with extensive experience of managing a range of global mobility programs. And David is here to make sure that we don't fall into any unwanted traps when exploring the benefits and opportunities that global mobility offers. Harriet Shervill is the Chief People Officer at Iris. Iris are a global creative agency, and there Harriet is responsible for thousands of employees. Those employees are spread across 17 offices and 5 continents. So over the past year, Harriet's been managing all of those, but still managed to find time to write a blog called The Diary of a Chief Pandemic Officer. And that's all around the real-time challenges that they've been experiencing and how they've overcome them. So a really great read. If anyone gets the time to do it, we'll make sure we include it in the follow-up material. So again, thank you both for joining us this afternoon. But before I hand over, I'm going to quickly introduce Instant Impact and set the scene and make it clear why we're interested in this topic. So I'm one of the founders and co-CEOs of the business, and Instant Impact, for those who haven't heard of us before, we are in-house recruitment experts, and we work as an extension of our clients' HR functions and provide them with the team, the expertise, the marketing and technology that they need for all of their recruitment to make high quality, diverse hires directly. And a big part of that is to help them cope with what is a very fast moving and very fast changing global scene. I mean, as in talent as it is in any area. And some of the topics that we've really been deep diving into over the last year, but I mean, particularly as this phase of the pandemic has been evolving, really helping companies with their remote working policy, the way that they look at talent, and then also sort of related but not directly, the diversity as well of their teams. So, of course, I think it's probably clear to everyone, we're undergoing a time of change that's absolutely unprecedented in most of our lifetimes. So just to make it through the pandemic, we've all had to make decisions around our working style that would usually have taken years to plan for and execute. And we've all made absolutely monumental shifts just to deal with lockdown, homeschooling, and then the ever-changing face of this pandemic. So, I mean, a company that used to be based in one office in central Manchester might now have employees working remotely all over the UK, probably over Europe, if not the world. So to do that, we've adopted new technologies, management styles, and we've really been re-examining the way that we look at talent and workforces across the board. So do employees need to work from the office? What skills do they need in this new world? How do we keep our culture and values in a remote workplace, whereas before we relied so much on that face-to-face interaction? So now that we can see a light at the end of this tunnel, and I hope I'm not being too optimistic there, everyone's keeping their fingers crossed, but we've started working with our clients to analyze what worked and what didn't work during what was, in effect, the largest workplace experiment in history. And we've been working with them to decide what we're going to keep and what we're going to lose going forwards, and what was successful. And one of these big questions that we're helping our clients to answer now is how much of a remote working culture to retain. So many companies are planning to become remote first. Others are adopting a mixed approach, offering flexibility to work at home or in the office. But even those companies that do plan a full return to the office would have realized how effective that remote team can be. And look, to put it into context and our changing mentality on it, according to the ONS, before this pandemic, so in 2019, only 5% of people work from home on a regular basis, and now it's part of all of our lives. So as I mentioned just before, I think most companies that we're speaking to are planning on retaining a level of flexibility to work from home, but I'm really excited in particular by those that are exploring a remote first approach to their whole business, or to some employees, some functions, some roles. And shifting their mindset to become really purposeful global employers. And there's a whole lot to gain from that. So if you just look at availability of talent, there are developing nations like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and they're leading the world in their growth of tertiary educated talent. There's an oversupply on many of the same skill sets that there's an undersupply of in the UK, Europe, and the US. So just to put that into perspective, there are 4,500 Java developers registered in the UK on LinkedIn. Compare that to 31,000 in the US and 270,000 in the world. So some serious differences there. If you look at diversity, attracting and recruiting, retaining talent from different backgrounds becomes a lot easier. I mean, it's really easy to see how a global workforce can help with a more internationally diverse workforce and a more ethnically diverse workforce. But being remote first can also allow make your workplace more accessible for disabled and neurodiverse candidates who may not be able to commute into work, or being remote first might allow you to employ people from remote and cut off areas who otherwise wouldn't be able to commute into the office. And then finally, I think the point there is there's also a point around scalability. So if you've got a global and remote infrastructure, not only does it affect the employees that you can take on, but also the clients that you can work with. If you're able to staff anywhere in the world, it can mean, depending on the business, that you're able to target a much larger target market. But look, unfortunately, it's not as easy as flicking a switch as much as many of us wish it were. There are advantages, of course, to working together in person. So especially for creative business, I know Harriet's going to go into that, into some detail on that in the Q&A later, I'm sure. And there are some tax as well and legal implications that you'll hear about from David shortly. And it's certainly harder there's certainly some complications there. And there are also some of the elements that I think a lot of us value in our workplace. So that feeling of apprenticeship, so passing on what you know to the next generation, sort of mentoring someone in the workplace, that can be quite hard to replicate in a remote first world. Anyway, so regardless of where you end up, what side of the fence you sit on, I think it's going to be another year of rapid change in 2021. Companies are going to decide what they're going to maintain from 2020 and which bits they're going to go back to 2019 on. And there's no one size fits all approach, which is why companies are coming to such radically different conclusions. But regardless of which decision you go for, I think the most important thing is to be as informed as possible. So that's why it's enough from me. I'm going to call on our resident expert. David, over to you.
Hi, Felix, and thank you very much for having me today. Just so you all know what I do, I help organisations manage international employment tax issues, particularly helping those who have employees in various jurisdictions outside of the UK, or foreign employers who have individuals working into the UK. And if we could just flick to the next slide, that would be great. And the next one, please. Sorry, if we just go back. Thank you very much. So I think start off with taking a step back. What the past year has done is it's created, a real advancement in the way that employers have chosen to enlist and employ their workforce. And from my point of view, it's really exciting to hear so many organisations who now are, want to be flexible, who are now considering their working policies and saying, well, do you know what? We have really adapted so well to this remote working environment. Why should we go back? Why should we take on a long office lease? Why do we need that much space when we can be just as productive, if not more productive, when working from home? And I think that's created a huge advantage for being flexible. Has really created a huge advantage when employers want to become that employer of choice. And if we go back a few years ago, I think it's quite obvious pay was a huge factor when you were hiring an individual, and that individual, would be really concerned about, what about your, what's the package I'm on, what benefits do I get access to? And really, I think what we'll see in the future is the question will be just as high up in priority about, well, how flexible are you? And this has also allowed a number of organisations to say, well, look, if we can be flexible with remote work, well, what's the limit? Why can't we allow our staff to work in various countries? And equally, I think the pandemic has obviously naturally caused a lot of foreign nationals who are working in a particular country to say, well, I don't want to be on my own in lockdown, confined to a small space in the middle of a city. I would much rather be in my home country, safe and well with my family. So can I take my headset? Can I take my laptop and go and work from there? And I'm sure that's a real familiar story to everyone who's dialed into this webinar. But let me just tell you that there are some serious issues when an organisation puts an employee in another country in regard to not just taxation, but other factors such as social security, other regulations such as how do you legally employ somebody in that country when they're physically present there, as well as corporate tax and international benefit issues as well. And really, when I start with this, you can split this into two areas. You can think about employer issues or employer compliance, and then employee obligations. So the way that international tax authorities generally approach taxation of individuals is it's based on physical presence. And so when an individual is working in another country, that there's potential to say that will create a tax presence in that country, regardless of where they're paid. So as a result, somebody being paid from the UK who's now gone home to, let's say, Italy, they could be creating a tax presence in Italy by just being physically based and working there, even though they've got no interaction locally with any clients in Italy or any organizations there. And as a result of that, if there is an income tax presence arising, that can create huge ramifications for that individual in terms of personal costs and net pay. And generally, when it comes to taxation, it's not really as straightforward as being UK resident, as an example, versus non-resident. Because if somebody is working physically in the UK as a non-UK resident, they're still liable to UK income tax. The only difference being that if they're UK residents and working in the UK, they're just liable in the UK on their worldwide income, including their UK presence. So what that means is, from an employee perspective, what happens if somebody goes abroad, they work in another country, they create an income tax liability through their own physical presence there, but they remain UK residents, and then as a result, they are liable not only in that other country for income tax, but they're also liable in the UK because of their residency status. And as a result, you've got double taxation. So The other issue to think about from an employee perspective is social security. And social security, you could look at it as a form of tax. In the UK, we obviously call it national insurance. But essentially, it's covered under a different set of agreements, and it was covered under an EU directive. And since the Brexit deal, we have entered into the UK-EU Trading Cooperation Agreement. And thankfully, the new social security rules largely mirror the old rules in regard to postings up to 24 months. And what that means is, if we go back to that example of somebody in the UK working abroad, there's potential to say that you can put them in UK social security through applying for a certificate for home coverage for up to 24 months. And that provides some comfort there, but it does add something else to think about. The other issue is if let's say an income tax liability arises in another country, and you there as maybe a HR manager or head of people, you might think, well, that's the employee's problem. They've made a personal choice to go over to that country, and as a result, if they've got double taxation, we've said that they need to take personal advice there. Well, here's the complication and why it's never really as straightforward. If there is an income tax liability in another country, that tax authority will want to collect that income tax somehow. And they might ask the employer, who would be the UK employer, to set up a foreign payroll to administer the payment of that income tax over. And so what does that mean? It means that you have to create an administration cost for registering abroad. You have to think about how to maintain a payroll overseas. You then also have to think about how to maintain the UK payroll correctly, because if they're UK resident, you still have to think about deducting UK tax and then overseas tax, and then how do you manage the net pay? And without genuinely wanting to sound all doom and gloom here with the administration, there's an awful lot to think about in regard to income tax abroad, and it's not going to just be the employee's problem. From just sort of extending the remit over to benefits and expenses, I think one thing that gets overlooked quite heavily is the fact that you might have an employee who's insured with Bupa or AXA, or perhaps another mainstream UK healthcare provider. You've got to really check the policies carefully here when you've got somebody remotely working abroad, because you've got to think about whether they are covered from an international perspective, in terms of what if something goes wrong, are they covered in terms of their health, and do you have a duty of care to check this beforehand? Because again, if you've got an employee trapped overseas for whatever reason, that the local authorities might actually come back to you and say, well, you've got a responsibility here as placing them in this country. And then just to cover off the final employer obligation in regard to corporate tax, there are rules surrounding corporate tax overseas, and something which a few of you might be familiar with is the term permanent establishment. And what that's all about is if there is somebody overseas who is having a substantial presence in that country because of they are in a significant position with regard to maybe sales, as an example, if they are ending up concluding contracts or in some form of generating revenue from their position, then there's potential to say that there could be a fixed place of business established overseas for the UK company. Now, what that means is it needs to be something to consider that you as an organization need to really think about. And again, the potential consequences of that is if there is a fixed place of business established overseas, there could be an overseas liability to UK profits from a corporation tax perspective. And when you think about, again, let's take a step back, that simple granting of a yes, you can go and work overseas, if this is all uncovered without checking advice first, the consequences and opportunity costs could be quite heavy. I've just seen a really good question which asks about the difference between contractors versus employees and whether you still have a duty of care. So just to quickly cover that bit off, if quite a few of you, I assume, will be familiar with the legislation coming in a couple of months with regard to IR35, which is all about tackling self-employment versus employment, particularly in the area of personal service companies and contractors engaged with a UK organisation. IR35 is a UK specific legislation, but there are a number of tax authorities abroad who have equivalent IR35 regimes. And just because you've got a contractor doesn't necessarily mean that you can get them out of an employee obligation, because if factually they are acting in the same way as an employee, then essentially you do have to undertake a review equivalent to IR35 overseas. Or if they are working in the UK, then it's likely they will already come into IR35 for you. And this just takes me on to the next slide, which this has been a gradual journey over the past few months, and I've worked with a lot of organisations who've now done quite a lot of self-education, which is really, really good to see that they're becoming more aware of the issues in hand and covering off what I've talked about. But there are a number of assumptions that I'm seeing clients get caught out by. And for example, there are a number of double tax agreements that the UK has with countries overseas, and usually around Article 14 or 15 of that double tax agreement, there's an employment income article. And what that generally says is if it follows something called the OECD treaty model, then there are 3 general points that must be adhered to in order for an income tax exemption to apply. And that will be, firstly, that individual, the employee, doesn't spend more than 183 days in a particular working period. That could be 12 months rolling. It could be within a 12-month calendar year, for example. That they mustn't have any of their costs recharged to an entity that you have overseas. And they mustn't have what I've touched on, they must not be working for a permanent establishment overseas. And what's really, really important to know about this is if you break one of those conditions, generally income tax could apply from day one. And the other thing is that a lot of countries have something called the economic employer principle, which is almost a caveat which takes away those 3 conditions if there is a substantial presence being established in that country as a result of their economic activity. So in other words, they're having a big impact in that country through the work that they are generating. So a real red flag here is don't assume the double tax treaty exemption applies. You must look at it on a case-by-case basis. The second point I just want to cover off is social security, and I did mention the fabulous rules that have now been adhered to in regard to the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and how that mirrors largely postings from a pre-Brexit time. In other words, can you get a certificate of coverage or an A1 if you're thinking about the European Economic Area for individuals working overseas? And here's the big thing that people aren't realizing. All of those rules are to do with posting. And what that means is that's you putting them in a country for a business purpose, for a reason. They are being posted for a particular period of time overseas. You might think that you're eligible for an A1 certificate, which, as a reminder, keeps employees in UK national insurance and employers in UK national insurance, which will avoid that obligation overseas. But some countries will throw that out the window if there is a personal request and granted to work overseas because it's not technically a posting. So it's a really, really important consideration that I've seen quite a few clients get caught out on. That's what I want to flag to you today. I've also mentioned about permanent establishment risk. You've got to have some evidence really to support the fact of what these individuals are doing overseas and whether there is no permanent establishment risk, because if the authorities inquire into it, they will ask for substance. And as I've said on the screen, role, impact, seniority, it makes a real difference, and it's something you should review to protect your corporate profits from being taxed overseas. And then another thing I've heard quite a few times is assuming that the only problem really is tax. And I've already mentioned about UK benefits being an issue, but you've got to think about immigration. You've got to think about employment law. I advised a client earlier who was talking to me about potentially allowing their employees to go on holiday overseas for a period, then undertaking work overseas. Well, if they went to the immigration authorities on the way back and they asked, what are you here for? Business or pleasure? And they said, well, it's a working holiday. They would just see that as work. And so you've got to have the right work permits and visas in place. And as I've said, just underneath that point, it's the authorities that will look to the employer as having to provide a duty of care, and the responsibility will be on you as having your employees in another country. And then here's the final point. Where do you draw the line on fairness? You've got to think about your HR policy. What I would immediately advise for everyone on this call is, if you don't have some policy that says you've got to let us know where you're working all the time, because there could be ramifications from a tax or social security or administration perspective for us to be aware of and take advice on, I would put that in a policy pretty swiftly. And then finally, double taxation isn't our problem, is something I've heard about an employer, and I've explained the rules about how the onus of payroll is the responsibility of an employer there. And if there is compliance due overseas, you've got the cost of registration, you've got the cost of maintaining that registration, and all this has to be balanced really against managing key talent. And I've seen organisations very sadly lose some really key talent over the last 12 months because the cost of keeping those employees has been too great. So I hope that's been useful, and I'm very happy to take questions towards the end of the webinar.
That was really, really interesting, David. And I definitely think a bit of a shot in the arm, is a bit of awakening for anyone that's thinking of doing it without having planned it, this well. So thank you so much for that. And I know there are some questions, and we'll try and get to them at the end. But first off, now we're in the Q&A section. I just wanted to go to Harriet. So from tax and those sorts of implications, I know that you're really one of the things that you're passionate about is around culture, and I'd be really interested in hearing what effect COVID had on the global culture at Iris, and what elements of that you're planning on keeping with you when all of this is over.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, David. That was very interesting. I've taken some notes down myself. So yeah, at Iris we have agencies in like 17 countries, as Felix said, so dotted around the globe. One of them being in London, where I'm based. So globally, every agency had its challenges during COVID. Reductions in revenue and understanding furlough and the other government schemes, and culture, sort of understanding how we've really retained our culture. So we had to move really quickly to adapt. Obviously, an obvious one, which you talked about earlier, Felix, was working from home. So obviously overnight we had to move everybody to be super flexible and work from home, and we had to do that globally. And as an agency, you mentioned about 5% working from home, and I think that's where we sort of sat. People work from home ad hoc when they wanted to catch up on things or needed a bit of time away from the office. But ultimately, this drastic change enabled us to just really look at our working practices and how we want to be set up when we go back into the office. So at the end of last summer, when things were looking a little bit more positive in London, we were looking at our return to the office and what our plan would be. And I think what COVID has taught us is working from home works. I don't think anyone can argue with that. We've all done it, maybe for a little bit too long for some of us, but it definitely works. But what's really clear is that people miss connections, they miss interactions with their colleagues, there's sort of water cooler moments. And also people want the option, they want flexibility, they want to be able to go into the office if they want. So as we look to go back to the office, we're looking at a blended model, so sort of split between office and home or coffee shop or anywhere else within tax reasons. And we want everybody to do that. The way that we're setting it up is that people would be in the office for 2 days a week and then sort of at home or wherever else for 3 days, or more in the office if they prefer, if that's a preferred working style. But ultimately, what we want to do is drive connectivity. So we want to make sure there's flexibility, but with structure and a framework. So the way we're setting that up is to ensure that people come in on 1 day a week that's set. So for example, the people team would come in every Tuesday, we all go in on that day. And that means that we as a team can connect, we can catch up, we can work together. It also means we could do a team meeting on that day. We can ensure new joiners start on that day. So we ensure sort of real connectivity. And then you come in on another day that suits you. But what you can do is you can do that around other connections. So if I know that somebody in the finance team comes in every Thursday, I can use that day to go in and speak to them. So ultimately there's flex, but with a bit of structure to enable those connections. We're trialing it in our Singapore office at the moment, as they're a little bit ahead of where we are from a COVID perspective, and it's going really well. And what we found important is, although in London, sadly, we feel a little bit further away from that model at the moment, we have really communicated that to the agency. I think it's really important that people are aware of what our future model looks like. They can plan their lives. You know, a lot of our employees live really near the agency, and obviously that comes with high rents. And actually now they know they need to be in 2 days a week. Where does that mean that they will live? You know, they can make a few decisions on that. So, you know, we will be using this as a long-term change to where people work, which is important. And I think the other thing that we've looked at as part of this is when people work. So obviously there's the where, you know, is it in the office, is it at home, but actually flexibility in when people work. So, you know, many people have been juggling homeschooling, you know, they're still doing that now, caring for family, and ultimately just looking after themselves in this sort of strange time. And I think what that's really taught us is the 9 to 5:30 model, or 9 to 5, wherever your hours are, really, it doesn't really work anymore. So we've been really clear with people that it's up to them when they do their work. It needs to be at a time that works for them. We've really tried to actively encourage people to take long breaks in the day if that's when, you know, you can actually see some sunlight. And, you know, rather than be on Zoom all the time, why don't you take a phone call and go for a walk and flex your hours to sort of make sure that it works around you, which has been really important, because ultimately it doesn't matter when people work. You know, it's just about getting the work done. So we've created some structure around this, again, a bit of a framework. So rather than people making excuses, I've got to do this, I can't be there for 10, what we've done is introduce core hours. So where meetings take place between 10 and 4, and then people can flex their working hours around that. So, you know, if you start at 10, you might want to finish at half 6. And I think that gives people the permission to be able to do it. And like I said, they're sort of not making excuses. And you know, it's something that we will really continue to do as we go back into the office. I mean, the other thing to touch on when we talk about culture is about the actual sort of culture and energy of the agencies. You know, we've got the flexibility side, but it's actually how do we retain that culture? And that's been a big sort of challenge for us, as you know, although we've been geographically sort of spread out, actually having employees dotted around different countries, as you know, it brings with it its challenges. You know, we have an awesome office, a really great culture. You know, you can really feel the energy and the buzz as you go in, and suddenly that was taken away. So we've really lent into internal comms. It's been really important that us as a business and as a people team, we've been communicating at speed, and making sure that people are aware of what's going on in the agency, and messages are you know, messages are being received by our people. And actually, when you can't meet in person, communication becomes everything, really. So one of my team, Rebecca, who's brilliant, has pivoted into a comms role. She's got a marketing background. She's been incredible, and she's really focused on communication, how we boost our culture, our morale, how we're delivering the right messages at the right time, and ensure people understand what's going on in the agency. And when you consider that there's so much uncertainty there was last year, and there is now, you know, we need to ensure people understand what's going on. So we've been really communicating. And this has also helped people feel connected. So like I said before, people miss that connection, those human interactions. So we've been using comms to drive that as well. One of the ways we've done that is through music. So one of our employees hosted Iris FM, which is our radio station, through Teams. So we created this every Friday. All agencies around the globe tuned in, so at various times they've made comments, they've made requests, and actually really connected over the music, which was amazing. It's now become a regular feature for us, and we now have it monthly, and different agencies host a show, so we can showcase the people and the music and their passions, and it's working really well. And I think what became really clear is that sort of lack of physical building and office space, and the brilliance of Zoom or Teams or whatever platform you're using actually meant you can connect really easily globally. We actually feel closer together and more connected than we ever have. And we really tried to use that to our advantage. So, you know, we launched a new training platform in last year, and where we tapped into the brilliant people in our network and asked them to host a training session on key topics. And you just couldn't do that before the world was working in this way. You know, the flexibility that you could just dial into from New York to to a webinar in London, you no longer needed to book a room and hope it was free and get some chairs out and all the sort of admin and hassle that comes with it. And really, it's just important to us that ease continues when the world opens up. And we're sort of repositioning our learning offering around that. How do you make it more bite-sized and easier to access it, and much more global, which was much harder to do when we were all in the office. So sort of gone are the days when you sit in day-long training sessions. So yeah, I think the ease of technology has actually, as a global network, made us feel more connected and actually helped our culture in some ways.
Wow, it's so interesting. I love the idea of having an office DJ. I'm not sure. I think you have to be a pretty cool company to be able to pull that one off. But I'm not sure how the office would feel about me cranking out my country.
I'm not on a day.
So we had a really great question while you were talking, which is, I think, a balance that a lot of companies are finding it difficult to strike, is balancing over communicating with and preventing employees from feeling communication fatigue. How have you guys approached that?
The communication style, sorry, and frequency has changed a lot throughout. So I think we started off by just over communicating, just communicating constantly. We were able to measure what people responded to, what people want, got feedback. And then Rebecca has really got a sort of flow and a style of how we communicate. And we adapt and change that style, because ultimately, as we went into the new lockdown, the messaging was different, the tone was different. As we were sort of feeling a bit more positive in the summer, we could talk about different things. So we have really flexed and reviewed, and it's been a really big focus for us. But I think it's about adapting to the constant changes.
That's really interesting, and I think the over communication at the beginning and as each thing changes is so important, because one of our clients actually hosted a webinar. They're called Kooth, and they are mental health experts, and it was one of their business psychologists is saying that what we're going through is more akin to an actual trauma than anything else, and sort of regular communication throughout that's so important. Anyway, hopefully we're coming to the end of fingers crossed. So I had another question in from anonymous attendee who's basically asked if they've got a remote only hybrid approach, and they're wondering if there's a time frame that they can allow employees to work abroad without those tricky questions and tax implications. So for example, if they're going abroad for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that. And David, I wonder whether you could go into where's the point where you need to really start worrying when your team's working abroad? I, for one, was particularly tempted by, I think it was Barbados, who just said, come and work here for 6 months. How about those sorts of questions? When do we need to start to worry?
It's a very good question, one I've had quite a few times. The answer is, unfortunately, there's no one size fits all here. You could very easily, Felix, say something like, well, if I go to Barbados or for 2 weeks, I'm not going to have any tax implications as a result, am I? I mean, and you could do some research at the start, which sort of looks at the background facts of each individual as a person, looks at things like their background residency, whether they've spent any time there previously, look at whether there's a double taxation agreement, do your research on all of the employer and employee compliance that I mentioned at a few minutes ago. But here's an example, right, which is where I've seen it get caught out quite a lot. There's been a lot of concessions that have been introduced over the past few months from various tax authorities, which have been very welcomed. For example, the UK introduced 60 days as exceptional circumstances for being stuck in the UK because of lockdown, self-isolation, which could be exempt from residency. You've got to add up the total amount of time surrounding those days as well, for somebody being in a country. And if you had somebody who, say, is going out to a particular country from tomorrow, they're going out for 2 weeks, you think there's no issue. You look at, you've looked at the day counts going forward. Well, if they're going back to a country they've already been to previously, so they spent Christmas there, they spent some of last year there, you could easily add those days up, and that's the background facts you need to make sure that you consider before you consider that quick 2 or 3 week period.
It's really interesting, and coming dangerously close to sinking my hopes of the Barbados working style. But
Sorry.
no, not at all. Adam here has asked us a question to you specifically, David, asking around, because of the reality of the employer/corporate issues that remote working creates, do you think that we're not looking at a paradigm shift when it comes to remote working in a post-pandemic world? So in a year's time, do you think that we'll be back working in an office in the more traditional sense?
I think I really like Harriet's idea here, which was the hybrid working model. I think that's what employees will look for, as importantly as pay and remuneration, which is what the old number one factor was, let's say. So will we go back to normal? I mean, well, nobody's got a crystal ball, but I think the future of work has advanced substantially over the course of the past year. And we might have, if COVID or the pandemic hadn't have happened, we might have said in 20 years we might not have offices. Well, that has brought that 20-year period so far forward that we've got to I don't think we can go back really fully. I don't know what you think, Harriet, but
yeah, I think that employers will get left behind. I think if you have to choose a job offer, one which means you have to be in an office 5 days a week, 9 to 5:30, and the other means you could be, but also you could be in 2 days a week, I think that's where you would choose. I think people really want flexibility now. So I think people will get left behind if they don't change.
And I think, just adding finally, from what we see from a recruitment perspective, we're at the sharp end of this. More and more, we're getting asked early doors, what's the work from home, what's the work from home requirements and flexibility around there. We're also getting asked, can you talk us through how the business responded to COVID? What measures did they take? What support did they put in place for their employees? What support they put in place going forward? It's really, I think, brought into sharp focus the relationship between employer and employee, and the blurring of work-life balance, even more so than we were talking about before. So I think, actually, Harriet, question from you. Do you think that the relationship between employer and employee has changed, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think employees expect more from their employer. They expect, to your point, they want flexibility. They want to see their values. They want to understand what's important to them more than just a job. And that's become really apparent this year. And you're right. I mean, understanding how they treat their people, what they value, what they find important, and it's much more about culture and how an employer responds rather than the money, as you said. That's definitely not the key factor anymore.
Absolutely, David. You're up again. I think we're going for so a question around, if the employment contract already sort of states that the employee must stay in the country where they're employed, and any change has to communicate it to the employer as you recommended. Will tax authorities still expect the business to regularly check where the employees are working? Is question one. But then related to that, I think a question we had a while back that hasn't been a good time to ask it, but how do governments go and track that physical presence for tax liability?
So yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, to cut a long story short, the government overseas authorities will expect you as an employer to have a duty of care to identify, track and monitor your employees where they are in the world. They see that as your responsibility. It's not even just, as I said, about tax. It's just about well-being. It's about if something went wrong, a lot of employers would want to have a contingency policy to help manage a crisis in another country and where their employee is. The tricky situation I've found over the past year is, I mean, if we popped up tomorrow with a slightly different background, we could say, oh, I've moved rooms, but actually I've got on a plane overnight and I've gone over to another country and I haven't told my employer. That's why it's really, really important from a HR perspective to get that in agreed as a policy, because you've got to have a control on where your employees are and really give them a list of do's and don'ts. I think even out of courtesy, they need to let you know in case there's costs that are going to arise as a result of them sneaking off to work in the Bahamas.
Absolutely. So quick. Okay. So for Harry, I think given that you've got such a you cover so many offices, I think you have a really interesting perspective on this one. So with Brexit and more mobility, are you guys? What do you think is going to happen to the London talent pool? So do you think it's going to continue to be a hub for international talent as it is at the moment, or do you think that or do you see more London-based companies doing more international hiring?
That's a difficult one. The difficulty is with Brexit and the new sponsorship system. It's more expensive. So to sponsor talent and talent that could be hired, we would be able to tap into from across Europe. Obviously now we have to sponsor, comes with quite a high price tag. So I think that is really going to affect how people hire, and I think it will be really interesting to see. Really, is London going to be the centre? Will people feel as comfortable to come over? Will they be able to? Will they have the opportunities to be able to come over? Will we be able to attract that talent? So I'd be really interested to see.
And just to add on from our perspective, I think we've always. I think London, as we know, is such an amazing talent pool. I think we've got some of the most. London and I think also the other major cities in the UK. There's such a concentration of talent in the areas that we work. So in professional services, financial services, marketing, tech. I think that it's going to take a long time for that depth of talent to fade away. I think so. If you look at Silicon Valley, for example, smart people gravitate and ambitious people gravitate to like-minded people. I think there's such a buzz to working in London, and as we do get back into the workplaces, I think it'd be very difficult for companies to make a compelling case for that same talent to go and work in an office in Brussels, for example. But I, as you say, Harry, I think we shall see on that one.
Yeah.
It'd be the really big question of the next 5 years. Question from Steve, which is working abroad has an impact on your data protection controls. You're transferring data to an overseas location. Have you disclosed that, or do companies need to disclose that in privacy notices and SCCs? One interesting question. Harriet, David, either of you want to take the data protection question?
What after you have it, if you okay, standoffs there. Well, look, I mean, one thing, it's not my specialist area, but I do know that companies, again, in regard to that control, if employees are taking equipment abroad, and they really do have a serious duty of care if that equipment gets lost or damaged and there's data lying around the globe, that they have to have a kind of mechanism to remove that data remotely from the UK. Again, it's kind of, you don't want to have your employee data or your company data left on a laptop that gets inadvertently placed or stolen abroad and then that gets used. You need to have, again, you need to think about it. You need to think about what controls you put in place. And I don't think a lot of organizations have, so that's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, I just to sort of echo that, I think it's about having a policy for what we expect from our employees and making sure that is in line, working with the lawyers to make sure that it's in line with the various sort of policies and acts. But I do think it's something that you need to build in and make sure that people are aware of expectations, or of course people aren't going to know what to do and could end up in a bit of trouble.
Fantastic. Well, we are nearing the end, so I'm going to ask parting thought then. If you were to leave people with one thought from the webinar today, what would you want that to be? David, let's start with you, if you don't mind.
I think the best piece of advice I could offer really is this has been a really uncertain period, and a lot's happened over the past few months, and a lot of employers are thinking, what about when I place an employee over there for whatever reason? I think what everyone on the call should do, if this is relevant, is draw a line today. And if you are thinking about granting overseas home working requests, make sure you take advice before the event on all accounts, because what you don't want to do is put somebody in another country and then realize that there are costs that have arisen when you could have made a choice to put them in that country beforehand.
Absolutely. Harriet, final thought?
Final thought from me. I guess if you are looking to work sort of remotely, if you're going to continue with that model, and hopefully it's happened anyway, but it's just about looking at every people touch point and making sure that it works from a remote perspective. I think, you know, there hasn't been much time. We've had to adapt really quickly and not look at everything, but everything from how we recruit to how we onboard has to work in a remote environment. You know, if you think about recruitment, for example, you know, you can't walk into an office and meet lots of people and understand an agency's vibe and culture. You meet a number of people on Zoom and look into their living room. So, you know, again, how do we make sure that the recruitment process means that you can really understand that business so you can ensure people join? But I think it's really important to just look at absolutely everything and in this new lens, really.
I mean, I couldn't agree with that more, Harriet. I think that's I think there's been a real the looking into people's living rooms has been a real sort of silver lining on a human element to the pandemic, which is, yes, we don't get to meet in the office, we don't get to see connections, but I get to meet my client's 3-year-old kid that's jumped onto their lap and is interrupting the call, or know that they have a dog, and or you know, see into their living room. I think there's almost a sort of privilege to live through this kind of world where we've all been through something horrific together, sort of blitz spirit, because I think in some ways it has brought us closer together. But my parting thought would be, please join us for an upcoming webinar. We've got 2 that are planned at the moment. We've got one on 4 p.m. on the 17th of February around empowering working parents in the remote workplace. My point on the 3-year-old kid was actually not plugging that one, but it worked very well. And then also 4 p.m. on the 10th of March, we're looking at the work-life imbalance. Actually there, I mentioned Kuth earlier, the mental health specialists, and they're going to be speaking around some of the effects that lockdowns had on us and our mental well-being as well. But anyway, thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, David and Harriet, for some really, really interesting talks. And we will be sending the recording around. We'll also be sending some links and some resources from Iris and Smith and Williamson as well. So thanks again, and have a fantastic evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you later.